What's up, guys, and welcome to the Olsen Angle. Today we're going to be bringing you a little 2020 NFL mock draft action. Now, for this mock draft, I'm not going to be including trades that could potentially happen, but I will make sure to notate if a team is likely to trade up or trade down if they're targeting a specific player. And during this mock draft, I'm going to provide context as to what the team did this offseason, what their biggest positional need is, and how their draft pick helps them address that. I'm sure it's going to be a long one, so make sure you strap in. The first pick in the NFL draft is held by the Cincinnati Bengals, and it should be a complete no-brainer. At this time period, the Bengals are going to draft Joe Burrow. I mean, Andy Dalton is not the answer there, and the Bengals really need to go ahead and reboot that franchise. When you look at Joe's numbers his senior season, they're unbelievable. They're almost video game-esque. And he does a great job of digesting coverage schemes. He puts touch on the football, and he really is able to go ahead and read and run through his progressions. A lot of college quarterbacks and even NFL quarterbacks really struggle with reading and running through their progressions. So the fact that Joe is already a step ahead of the rest of the game in that category is important. He's got excellent timing and anticipation and allows plays to develop. So it's almost a no-brainer that the Cincinnati Bengals have to select Joe Burrow. The second pick in the NFL draft is held by the Washington Redskins. And when you look at the Redskins, they really have a lot of different needs and interesting situations they have to address. I mean, their wide receiver core is weak. Terry McLaurin is really the only threat right now. Then you look at the quarterback situation. Dwayne Haskins came in midway through last year, didn't necessarily light the world on fire, but you do have Alex Smith coming back potentially from that broken leg 2 seasons ago. So again, there's always some question marks at the quarterback position going into this next season. You look at the Trent Williams situation, it's pretty clear and evident he's not going to play for the Washington Redskins at all for the remainder of his career. That issue they had with the misdiagnosis of his cancer obviously has really hurt his relationship with the organization. So that's something else they're going to have to go ahead and deal with in the upcoming months. And with Ron Rivera as the new head coach, a defensive-minded coach, I definitely expect the Washington Redskins to select Chase Young. If you watch Chase's film, you'll notice that very often he was either double-teamed or he was game planned for in every single down and scenario. He's got unbelievably fluid hips, and he's got active hands with a powerful punch. It allows him to go ahead and hit that offensive tackle and knock him off his track and really wreak havoc in the backfield. And you pair it up with a great explosion off the line of scrimmage. This is a guy who's really going to go ahead and cause nightmares for opposing offensive linemen. The Detroit Lions have the 3rd overall selection in the 2020 NFL Draft. And when you look at the offseason moves, it's been pretty obvious that improving that defense has been at their forefront. They've added pieces like Jamie Collins, Danny Shelton, Desmond Trufant, and Duron Harmon. Bob Quinn's objective was to improve the defense. They also lost a perennial Pro Bowl corner in Darius Slay. So when you look at the pieces they brought in this offseason and the needs they still have to address, the biggest one I feel like is the corner position. I know they brought in Desmond Trufant, but again, that's no Darius Slay. They also need to improve their pass rushing presence, and that could be done through edge rushers. And I think later on in the draft, you might also see them target an interior offensive lineman. So looking at their team needs, I think the perfect fit for them is Jeff Okudah. He's a tall corner that can cover big threat wide receivers. He's got excellent closing speed. He can go ahead and work a little bit on play recognition, but when you look at Jeff, he's a young man who's got all the physical tools to be a shutdown corner in the NFL. The Detroit Lions have been linked to reports saying that they're looking to go ahead and trade back in this year's draft. And when you look at possible trade partners, the big ones that stick out are the Los Angeles Chargers and the Miami Dolphins. Both of them are in the market to go ahead and draft a quarterback early in this year's draft. So if you like Tua more or Justin Herbert, depending on what your preferences are for a team, that is definitely a candidate that you can go ahead and trade back with. The New York Giants have the 4th overall selection in this year's draft. And when you look at their offseason moves, most notably bringing in James Bradbury and Blake Martinez to kind of help bolster that defense. When you look at the biggest needs for the Giants, it has to be improving that offensive tackle position, adding some depth to the wide receiver core, and helping out with pass rush presence. They were number 22 in the league last year with sacks. I think the Giants are going to go with Isaiah Simmons here. When you look at what he did at the NFL Combine, it obviously rose his stock significantly. He's a defensive weapon, to say the least. And I mean, you run a 4.39 40-yard dash, and you have a 39-inch vertical at 6'4", 238 pounds. You're extremely versatile, and you can be used in a lot of different ways for defenses. He had 8 sacks last year for Clemson in only 71 pass rushing situations. That's unbelievable. He's an outside linebacker that can cover sideline to sideline and does a great job avoiding blockers. He's really slippery in that manner. Now, as of recent, Dave Gettleman, as we get closer to the draft, has been saying that he is entertaining the idea of trading back in the first round. Now, Sure, do I believe him? Why not? But in the same token, Dave Gettleman has never traded back ever in the first round since he's been a general manager. So if history is any indication on what he's going to go ahead and do, unless the trade is significant, I don't see him trading back from the number 4 spot. Given I think it would benefit the Giants because, again, they need to help out that offensive line. They need wide receivers. And the offensive line class and the wide receiver class this year is extremely deep. So acquiring some extra draft capital would help out the Giants. The Miami Dolphins have the 5th overall selection in this year's draft. And if you look at the offseason moves, they've definitely put a focal point on improving the defense. Their most notable moves this offseason were bringing in Byron Jones, Eric Flowers, Shaq Lawson, Landon Roberts, and Kyle Van Noy. Again, when you look at these moves, it's been a concerted effort to improve the defense. And they've worked from the back forwards. So they've gone ahead and shored up the cornerback position. They have Byron Jones and Xavier Howard. They're the first and the second highest paid corners in the entire NFL. The biggest needs the Miami Dolphins still need to address this offseason are the quarterback position, offensive line, safety, and running back. I know recently there's been a lot of speculation that the Miami Dolphins are more interested in Justin Herbert than Tua Tagovailoa. But I will say this much. As we get closer to the NFL draft, it's a time period where a lot of teams put out smoke screens and try to spread misinformation on what their actual interests are so they can go ahead and try to lower the demand for a specific player they're targeting. And I think that's what they're doing with Justin Herbert. I think their biggest want, even since the beginning of this offseason, was Tua Tagovailoa. Tua's a dual threat guy. He put up video game-esque numbers also. And I mean, he's got 8 touchdowns per 1 interception. He's a guy with a quick release. And he consistently, accurately delivers the ball to his receivers. And he's working, of course, with a good casting crew around him. I mean, in this year's draft, you got wide receivers like Jerry Jeudy and then Henry Ruggs that are, on his wide receiver crew at Alabama. So this is a guy who definitely has the ability. But the biggest issues with him, obviously, are the injuries and what implications that could have on his future. If you date it all the way back since when he started at Alabama, I mean, he broke his index finger. He had high ankle sprains in his right and left ankle, which required surgery. He had that hip surgery. He broke his wrist in spring ball. He came back a little too early, then re-broke it that same spring ball. So there's definitely some injury questions regarding Tua. I think Tua has been the leading candidate for the quarterback position since the offseason started for the Miami Dolphins. I don't take much into the recent reports saying that Herbert's taken over, the leaderboard for them. So I got to go ahead and pick the Miami Dolphins getting Tua Tagovailoa with the 5th overall selection. The Los Angeles Chargers had the 6th overall selection in this year's draft. And when you look at their offseason moves, they brought in Trey Turner from the Carolina Panthers in exchange for Russell Okung. And then they brought in Brian Bulaga to help solidify that offensive line. They also helped out the defensive line, bringing in Linval Joseph, and also the secondary group by bringing in Chris Harris Jr. So they definitely made some moves to help bolster that roster. They did lose Melvin Gordon, and they did lose Phillip Rivers. Obviously, those are 2 big losses. When you look at the biggest need the Chargers have to address this offseason, it's got to be the vacant quarterback position. And I have to think that at the number 6 overall selection, they would select Justin Herbert. He's got a consistent and repeatable throwing motion, an absolute cannon for an arm, and he makes good reads at the line of scrimmage. What I think hurt his draft stock a little bit is if you look at the last 3 games he played against Oregon State, Utah, and Wisconsin. He threw for under 200 yards in each one of those games. I don't think it significantly impacted his draft stock, but it didn't help, again, when you're getting down to the nitty-gritty part of the schedule, down where you're playing the tougher competition, you weren't technically lighting up the scoreboard. But I think Herbert's a great selection there for the Los Angeles Chargers, and that's going to be, again, their franchise quarterback for years to come. Then you have the Carolina Panthers at the 7th overall pick. And I talked about this in my last video, but this has been a nightmare scenario for the Carolina Panthers this offseason. It all started off by losing Luke Kuechly to retirement. Then you lost James Bradbury in free agency. You went ahead and traded away Trey Turner for Russell Okung. You lost Greg Van Roten in free agency. You lost virtually your entire defensive line. Mario Addison, Vernon Butler, Gerald McCoy, Dontari Poe, Bruce Irvin. I mean, you lost 5 pieces off your defensive line. And then you released Cam Newton. And to combat all those losses in free agency, you brought in Teddy Bridgewater and Robbie Anderson. Those are really the 2 big marquee moves for the Carolina Panthers this offseason. The biggest needs for them are trying to revamp that defensive line after all the pieces they lost off of last season. Trying to also go ahead and add a little bit to the offensive line. I mean, you lost both starting guards. And then when you look at it, the secondary also should be a priority for them in this year's draft. So with the 7th overall selection, I think Derrick Brown fits nicely for the Carolina Panthers. Now, he's not going to be a pass rusher or a guy who's going to be amassing a large amount of quarterback hurries anytime soon, but he's a guy who's going to be an unbelievable run stopper. He's extremely powerful, has a non-stop motor, and does a great job of disengaging from blocks and going ahead and tackling running backs and ball carriers. The Arizona Cardinals have the 8th overall selection in this year's draft. And when you look at their offseason, they were able to acquire DeAndre Hopkins for essentially David Johnson and a second-round pick. So that was a huge plus for them this year. They had a crowded backfield anyway with Kenyon Drake and Chase Edmonds. I mean, David Johnson's value was at an all-time low. So again, them being able to turn that into DeAndre Hopkins is huge. When you look at the biggest needs for the team, it has to be addressing the offensive line to provide Kyler Murray a little bit more protection. And, later on in the draft, I think they also need to add some pass rushers and a little bit of help at the cornerback position. But before I go ahead and tell you who they're going to select, it's kind of important to explain the offensive lineman situation in this year's draft class. There's really 4 top guys in this year's draft. And in no particular order, it's Mekhi Becton, Jedrick Wills, Tristan Wirfs, and then Andrew Thomas. I break this group of 4 down into 2 separate categories. Guys that are NFL ready right now and guys that have a high ceiling and high potential. I think the 2 players that are most NFL ready are Andrew Thomas and Jedrick Wills, and the players that are more high potential guys have to be Mekhi Becton and Tristan Wirfs. And I'm going to explain as to why I have them grouped that way, but with this 8th overall selection, I think the Arizona Cardinals select Jedrick Wills. I know Wills only played right tackle in college, and I know that's a big knock on it this time period. People say, well, he's never played left tackle. How does he go ahead and acclimate to that? Well, the reason he played right tackle is because Tua is a left-handed quarterback, so that's Tua's blind side. So yeah, he was the offensive tackle on the blind side of Tua. So I consider that a little bit of a wash. And he's not as tall as the other guys. He's only 6'4" at the NFL Combine, so he's not 6'5" or above. It might not be as sexy as a 6'5" offensive tackle, but when you look at Jedrick Wills, I think he's unbelievably talented. When I broke down all their film, I thought Wills was the most polished. And when you look at his performance at the NFL Combine, I think he had the quickest feet, and his movement skills he displayed really shot him up on people's boards. He had an unbelievably powerful punch, and when you look at his kick slide, I want to argue that he has the best kick slide out of those 4 guys as of right now. I think it's the most polished, it's the most consistent, he doesn't tend to overset, he doesn't struggle as much with twists and stunts. I think he is the most consistent offensive lineman in this year's class. At number 9 come the Jacksonville Jaguars, and this is one of the most interesting picks, I think, of this year's draft. When you look at their offseason moves, they traded away Calais Campbell and A.J. Boye for absolute peanuts. I think they did a good job of getting rid of Nick Foyle's contract, but they lost big pieces in Calais Campbell and A.J. Boye. They just recently released Marcel Darius, who I know missed the majority of last season, but that's another piece of their defensive line gone. And Yannick Ngakoue is just recently franchise tagged, and he is disgruntled. He doesn't want to play for the Jaguars, so you have to wonder if that's going to be a scenario where you tag a guy and try to trade him at the NFL draft. And when you look at it, they only really brought in Joe Schobert and Darqueze Dennard. Again, so this has definitely been an offseason that hasn't improved the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars' biggest needs this offseason are offensive line, defensive line, and cornerback. And I was conflicted on this pick because they need to protect Gardner Minshew, obviously. He received a whole bunch of pressure in his face last year, and they need to address that. They also want to go ahead and open up some holes for Leonard Fournette. With Ngakoue very upset and wanting to be traded, requesting a trade, that's 3 big pieces of their defensive line they could potentially lose this offseason. And I kind of went a little bit off the board and selected Javon Kinlaw. Javon has great hands, and he is extremely powerful. He gains ground with every single step. He does a great job of disengaging from blocks, whether that be with a rip, a spin, a swim move, a straight bull rush, it doesn't matter. He does a great job of disengaging from blocks. He's another guy that has an outstanding motor, who's extremely quick off the snap of the ball and had an excellent Senior Bowl. When you look at the flaws for Javon, I think there's really only 2. The biggest one being is he is a little out of control when he plays the position, which can lead to explosive plays for the other team's offense. And also, he can work a little bit on his initial punch. It's not always on the breastplate. He doesn't always make first contact. Sometimes he lets those offensive linemen get inside hands on him. So again, just working on that punch consistency and being a little bit more in control would help him out greatly. At the 10th overall selection, you have the Cleveland Browns. and I think they have had an outstanding offseason. They brought in some really big pieces. Carl Joseph as a safety. They brought in Jack Conklin, an outstanding offensive tackle, and Austin Hooper, a great tight end. And when you look at the pieces they lost Joe Schobert, TJ Carey, and Demarius Russell. After this offseason's moves, the Browns' biggest need is to add a left tackle. They also need to go ahead and address the defensive line and linebackers in this year's draft. So with the 10th overall selection, I have the Browns picking Mekhi Becton. Now, Mekhi is 6'7", 364 pounds, and he ran a 5'11". It's unbelievable he's able to move that quick for how big he is. I think he has a good kick slide. He's extremely athletic, especially for his size, and he takes good angles on blocks, especially on the second level. You see him go ahead and block to where the guy will be, not to where he is. Sometimes he can be a little late on his punch, but again, he's so big, he can just maul people with his size. He doesn't even have to get hands on first because his arm length is so long. He's able to go ahead and reposition his hands and get them back inside on the defensive lineman. Now, I told you earlier, I put Mekhi Becton in more of a high ceiling, more potential S-type player right now. And the reason I have him at that classification is because when he can learn how to get hands on the defensive lineman first and deliver a quick and powerful punch to a D lineman, especially a defensive end, my God, it's game over. But again, he's just a little late on his punch. He can tend to overset defensive ends occasionally, not all the time. He was only able to scratch the surface of his potential at Louisville. If he's able to continue to improve, you're looking at a really special left tackle in the future for the Cleveland Browns. At the 11th overall pick, you have the New York Jets, who have made a concerted effort this offseason to improve the offensive line. They brought in Greg Van Roten this offseason, Connor McGovern, and George Font. They paid these guys sizable contracts because they expect them to be part of the solution on the offensive line. It's no secret that Le'Veon Bell really wasn't able to get things started last year. The Jets' offensive line was hideous, and adding those three pieces really helps address that. I see a lot of mock drafts out there having the New York Jets selecting an offensive tackle with their pick here at number 11 overall, and I just don't see it. They already added three significant pieces to help the offensive line this offseason, and the fact that they lost Robbie Anderson this offseason off of a less than impressive wide receiver core last year, I think it only makes common sense for the New York Jets to select a wide receiver at the number 11th overall selection. I think CeeDee Lamb out of Oklahoma fits perfectly for them. He's a big play talent with sure hands. He's extremely elusive and has great vision with the ball. The amount of havoc he's able to wreak with the football is unbelievable. He also does a great job of working back to the ball instead of letting the ball come to him. So, off of a team that really needs to go ahead and bolster their wide receiver core, I think CeeDee Lamb fits well for the New York Jets. At the 12th overall pick, you have the Las Vegas Raiders, and they have made some serious improvements to their team this offseason. They really helped out their linebacking core by adding Corey Littleton and Nick Kwiatkowski. Last year, it was no secret that the Raiders needed more linebacking depth, and they addressed that this offseason right off the bat. They also added Carl Nassib on the defensive line and Eli Apple. And I know Eli Apple hasn't lived up to expectations of where he was drafted by the Giants, but he's still young and can always right the ship. And I think most interestingly enough this offseason, they also added Marcus Mariota. When you look at their biggest team needs, it has to be wide receiver, adding a little bit more of the defensive back core, and offensive line depth. Richie Incognito is going to be 37 years old at the start of next year. So again, you don't get better when you're that old. It's no secret that last offseason, adding Antonio Brown didn't work out for the Raiders, but they still need the guy to be their number one wideout. They haven't had one since Amari Cooper left, and that's why with this 12th overall selection, I think they're going to pick up a wide receiver. And they also might be a candidate that might trade up in this year's draft to get the wideout they want. Whether it's Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, or Henry Ruggs, if they have a guy they're specifically targeting, I think it would be beneficial for them to trade up a few picks to secure that they get their wide receiver for the future. But with the 12th overall selection, I have the Raiders selecting Jerry Jeudy. Jerry has unbelievable speed. He clocked in at a 4.45 40 at the NFL Combine, and he's 6'1", so again, he's got good size. He runs excellent routes, extremely crisp routes, and you pair that up with that natural speed and that great jump, it allows him to create separation and really go ahead and make those throws easier for quarterbacks. And when you pair up that great speed with his size at 6'1", he really has a chance to be a big play wide receiver. The San Francisco 49ers have the 13th overall selections. And when I look at mock drafts and what people think is going to happen with this pick, it kind of leaves me scratching my head. There's some people out there who throw out the idea of, well, the 49ers traded away DeForest Buckner, so maybe they're just going to go ahead and draft a defensive tackle, and that's where Javon Kinlaw comes into play. But it just doesn't make sense. DeForest Buckner still had a year left on his contract, and the 49ers are competing for a Super Bowl right now. And maybe they'll look to pick up a defensive lineman later on in the draft, but with the 13th overall selection, I don't see there's any way they pick a defensive tackle up. They lost Emmanuel Sanders this offseason to free agency, so I think it only makes sense that they traded up for the 13th overall pick to target a wide receiver. And they're also a candidate I have as a trade-up candidate. So if they have a wide receiver they're specifically targeting, whether, again, it's CeeDee Lamb, whether it's Jerry Jeudy, or Henry Ruggs, if they feel like they have their guy, it wouldn't shock me at all if they trade up a few picks to secure their wide receiver. But this team's biggest needs are wide receiver, offensive line, and cornerback depth. The 49ers' biggest needs this draft are wide receiver, offensive line, and defensive back depth. And the reason I have offensive line in there is because Joe Staley's 35 years old. They have to start kind of looking for his replacement sooner rather than later. With the 13th overall selection, I think the 49ers select Henry Ruggs. And that's, of course, if they don't have somebody else in mind and trade up for, their wide receiver. He's got game-changing speed at a 4.27. My gosh, that's an official 4.27 time 40 at the NFL Combine. I mean, that's moving, guys. I mean, he gets great separation on those slants and can really go the distance. All he needs is a little bit of an inch. And again, that's when you see him kicking that high gear, and that 40 speed is going to be on display. He's got constant, consistent, steady hands, and he catches the ball with his hands. He's not a body catcher. So again, he's able to receive that ball, create a little bit of separation, and he can really go the distance and be a big play guy for the 49ers. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have the 14th overall selection in this year's draft. And it's been a huge offseason for them. Bringing in Tom Brady has really brought some life back to that organization and franchise. Obviously, in return, they lost Jameis Winston to free agency and Carl Nassib. Their biggest needs this draft have to be adding an offensive tackle and addressing the running back situation. Tom Brady only has a limited amount of starts left in his career. I mean, the guy, I think, is 43 years old now. He's not going to last till he's 50, 55. So again, their window is very finite. So they need to draft a very polished offensive lineman, which is why I have them selecting Andrew Thomas. Andrew Thomas is very technically sound and has good feet. When you look at his numbers at the Combine, they didn't necessarily pop in comparison to the other three. And again, I'm referring to Mekhi Becton, Tristan Wirfs, and Jedrick Wills. So I think the NFL Combine actually hurt Andrew Thomas's stock a little bit. Not significantly, but again, he didn't post those gaudy numbers like the other three guys did. But Andrew Thomas is extremely consistent, and you know exactly what you're getting in him, and he is going to be a successful offensive tackle at the next level. I think he's ready to step into the situation and start day one. The Buccaneers are really going to have to address the running back position later on in the draft, because it's no secret, the older Tom Brady gets, he's not going to be able to throw the ball as far and as many times as Jameis Winston did last year in Bruce Arians' offense. So they might have to go ahead and change up that offensive format a little bit, or rely a little bit more on the running game. The Denver Broncos have the 15th overall selection in this year's draft, and they definitely had a lot of moving and shaking this offseason. They brought in Graham Glasgow to replace Connor McGovern. They added Jarrell Casey, a really solid defensive tackle, but then they also lost Derek Wolfe at defensive end. But then they brought in a top-tier corner in A.J. Boye, and they brought in a top-tier running back in Melvin Gordon. The signing Melvin Gordon kind of left me scratching my head a little bit. And I know Philip Lindsay hasn't been able to catch the ball all that well since breaking his arm 2 seasons ago, and Royce Freeman has never really lived up to the hype. I guess, the Denver Broncos just kind of want to get rid of that running back by committee approach, and they just want, a stud running back in Melvin Gordon for the future. Their biggest needs going into this year's draft are wide receiver and offensive line. At 15 overall, I have them selecting Tristan Wirfs. And I know some people are going to be out there saying, wow, TJ, you have Tristan Wirfs sliding all the way to number 15. How is that possible? The guy's an athletic machine. He's extremely talented. He blew scouts away at the NFL Combine. He posted an unbelievably quick 40 time at a 4.86, a 10-foot 1-inch broad jump, and a 36.5-inch vertical. He's built like a Greek god. He's got huge thighs. He doesn't carry bad weight around in his stomach. He's got great feet. He performed extremely well in the Combine drills. The reason I have him sliding so far is I think he's a project. I think the other offensive linemen are a little bit more polished than him. If I had to put them in groupings, again, I think Tristan Wirfs is the least polished out of those top 4 guys. I watched his entire game film against Penn State, and I'm not going to put complete blame on him for this, but there's a lot of different times where he gets on separate levels in the guard, and he cannot handle a stunt or a twist move to save his life. And I don't want to just try to pick out isolated incidences from one game. But in the same token, if you can't pick up a twist move and the offensive guard and you are consistently on the wrong level and you're not able to pass that off, it doesn't bode well for you being able to step in and being a day one starter. I think Tristan Wirfs is an extremely talented offensive tackle. I think his ceiling is so high. I think he's extremely athletic. But you can't just ignore the fact that he struggled mightily against Penn State and couldn't go ahead and protect against a twist or a stunt to save his life in that game. I mean, you just can't omit that. And I mean, that defensive line at Penn State is more of what you're going to see in the NFL. Again, you're going up against guys like Yetur Gross-Matos. He's going to be a first-round pick too. That's what you're going to be seeing game in and game out in the NFL. And I just don't think he performed at the level you want in that particular scenario. Just to clarify, again, Tristan Wirfs, he's got unbelievable potential, great athleticism, built like a Greek god. But I think he's the least polished out of those 4 offensive linemen. And that's really the reason I have him slipping all the way to 15 here to the Denver Broncos. The Atlanta Falcons possess the 16th overall pick, and they've definitely made some adjustments this offseason. They went ahead and released Devontae Freeman and brought Todd Gurley in on a 1-year prove-it deal. After losing Austin Hooper in free agency, they brought in Hayden Hurst via trade from the Baltimore Ravens. Then they signed Dante Fowler after losing Vic Beasley to free agency. They also lost Desmond Trufant. But the biggest needs the Falcons have to address this draft are cornerbacks and pass rushers. That's why I have the Falcons selecting C.J. Anderson 16th overall. This corner tested as good as you can imagine at the NFL Combine. Again, a guy who ran a 4.39, had 20 reps at 225 as a corner, and had a 37.5-inch vertical. So he tested off the charts at the NFL Combine. And after watching film, he's got great closing speed. He can really jump a route and make a quarterback pay. He also does a great job of reading the quarterback's eyes, again, which helps him go ahead and make those pass deflections and interceptions. And at 6'1", he can really bully those smaller receivers. And he's got extremely fluid hips, which allow him to stay close to wideouts and coverage. The Dallas Cowboys possess the 17th overall selection in this year's draft. And this offseason as well has been pretty big for them. Mike McCarthy's the new head coach there, and there's a little bit of a moving and shaking on their roster. They lost an elite level corner in Byron Jones, an excellent pass rusher in Robert Quinn, and a very, very productive wide receiver in Randall Cobb. They went ahead and added Gerald McCoy and Dontari Poe to go ahead and strengthen up the interior of their defensive line. They also added Ha Clinton Dix and Greg Zuerlein. But you can't forget, Mike McCarthy apparently ran into Aldon Smith at the gym, and he had bulked and hulked up a little bit. I think he's at 290 pounds. So they gave it a 1-year prove-it deal to Aldon Smith. So they definitely have improved the interior of their defensive line. The biggest needs that they need to address in this year's NFL draft is an edge rusher, a corner, and a wide receiver. And that's why I have the Dallas Cowboys selecting K'Lavon Chaisson at number 17 overall. He's unbelievably quick off the snap of the ball and has great hip mobility. He really does a good job of dipping and ripping past offensive linemen. He's an extremely high character guy. For all you LSU fans out there, you know he was awarded number 18, which again is a very high honor for LSU. But something he does extremely well is he's able to turn speed rushes into power rushes. And what I mean by that is K'Lavon shoots off the ball so quickly that he beats the offensive lineman to the point where they would usually intercept, which means the offensive lineman has to try to alter his path. And as soon as he starts trying to alter his track, that's when you see K'Lavon hit him with the power rush right there, and that's when he's able to pressure the quarterback. He can work a little bit on his hand placement and punch, but I think he's got a really high ceiling. The Miami Dolphins have the 18th overall selection in this year's draft. And for the Dolphin fans watching the video, just to give a recap, the Dolphins' biggest needs in this year's draft were quarterback, which they addressed via Tua, offensive line, safety, and running back. So with this selection, I have them drafting offensive tackle Austin Jackson to help protect their quarterback. Austin is extremely athletic. He does a great job of redirecting on blocks. So as a defensive lineman tries to disengage, he does a good job of repositioning hands and repositioning his angle to continue on that block. I think he has good quickness off of the snap of the ball, and he's got good footwork in his pass pro. He can definitely afford to add some consistency in his footwork, though, and also work a little bit on his hand placement. The Las Vegas Raiders have the 19th overall selection. And a lot of mock drafts actually have them selecting a linebacker, which I just don't see. They added Corey Littleton and Nick Witkowski this offseason to the linebacking core, so I don't think drafting a linebacker is their biggest need at this point in time of the draft, which is why I have them selecting Xavier McKinney. Xavier's the best safety in this year's class, and he does a great job in coverage and has really good explosion driving towards the ball. He's versatile and can cover anybody out there in the field, whether it's a running back, wide receiver, or tight end. So this pick helps address the team need at safety. The Jacksonville Jaguars have the 20th overall selection, and again, just to recap the team needs they have, it's defensive line, offensive line, and cornerback. And I know the issue with Yannick Ngakoue no longer wanting to play for the Jaguars after being franchise tagged this year could definitely lead to a trade in this year's draft. And adding a rush defensive end like AJ Epinesa could really help the Jaguars. I think the Jags have a lot of different needs, but I think AJ Epinesa is a great pick for them. I know this is a little early compared to other mock drafts, I'm sure, but after watching the film, again, I was extremely impressed with what AJ had to offer. AJ's had 10 plus sacks his last 2 seasons in college and is extremely powerful. He's got great hand placement on his punch, he does a good job of extending his arms, and he plays low. The majority of his pressures and sacks all revolve around the bull rush in some capacity. What he does extremely well is he hits the offensive tackle, gets underneath him, extends the arms, knocks the offensive tackle off of his track, and as soon as he knocks him off his track, that's when he goes ahead and hits him with a rip, a swim, or a spin move, and he's able to disengage, and that's when he's able to go ahead and cause a sack or a quarterback hurry. You'd like to see him utilize finesse moves a little bit more often earlier in his pass rush situations, but again, he's extremely powerful and strong. At 275 pounds, he's got great explosion and can really knock those offensive tackles off their track and create havoc in the backfield. The Philadelphia Eagles have the 21st overall selection in this year's draft, and they've made some really good additions to their roster this offseason. They added a perennial Pro Bowl caliber cornerback in Darius Slay, and they went ahead and also helped bolster their interior defensive line by adding Javon Hargrave. Wide receiver and linebacker, though, are their biggest needs. When you look at things a little closer, you realize that wide receiver is the biggest need for this team. You look at Alshon Jeffrey, Deshaun Jackson, and Nelson Aguilar. Those 3 players missed a combined total of 24 games last season. And Alshon Jeffrey is 30 years old, and Deshaun Jackson's 33. Unfortunately, you don't become more healthy throughout an NFL season the older you get as a wide receiver. That's why I have the Eagles selecting Justin Jefferson with the 21st overall pick. Justin has unbelievable speed, clocking in at a 4.43 with a 37.5-inch vertical. He had 18 receiving touchdowns last season. That tied him for the second most receiving touchdowns in a single season in SEC history. He flat out produced last season. There's no way around it. He does a great job of high pointing the football and creates natural separation with good cuts and that elite level speed. The Minnesota Vikings have the 22nd overall selection in this year's draft. And wow, they definitely have had a lot of moving and shaking this offseason, and it doesn't all look good for the Vikings. They traded away Stephon Diggs. They essentially just swapped Linval Joseph for Michael Pierce. They lost 3 corners in Mackenzie Alexander, Trey Waynes, and Xavier Rhodes. And it doesn't look like Everson Griffin is going to come back in free agency either. So they lost a lot of important pieces on their defense from last year. Their biggest needs this draft are addressing the cornerback position and wide receiver. I mean, you lost 3 starting corners and you traded away Stephon Diggs. So those are obviously glaring holes that are in your roster now. That being said, apparently there's a rumor that the Vikings are in trade talks with the Cleveland Browns to go ahead and acquire Odell Beckham Jr. No idea the validity behind it, but it's important to note. That's why with the 22nd overall pick, I have the Minnesota Vikings selecting Christian Fulton. He's a cornerback with elite level speed. He ran a 4.46 40 and he's got good size. He blankets receivers and he's physical out there. People also use the term of he knows how to use his hands, prohibiting separation for the wide receiver, which means he knows how to clutch and grab the wide out when he's entering his route tree, and he doesn't get called for it. Obviously, if you continually do that and don't get called for it, that's great, because it obviously prevents the wide receiver from getting separation while running his route. But as the wideouts get better, just to play devil's advocate, when you're clutching and grabbing the wideout as he's entering his route tree, you might be called for that and might result a little bit more often in pass interference penalties. But this is a man with great size and all the physical attributes you need to be a successful corner at the next level. The New England Patriots have the 23rd overall pick in this year's draft, and this offseason has been a real bummer for them. I mean, they've lost a lot of different pieces. Obviously, most notable being Tom Brady. But they also lost a lot of pieces on defense. They lost Kyle Van Noy, Deron Harmon, Danny Shelton, Landon Roberts, and Jamie Collins. So they've lost a lot of different pieces on defense as well as Tom Brady. But this pick is a very odd one for the Patriots. They're in a situation where they don't have a franchise caliber quarterback anymore. And you kind of wonder what type of direction do they want to take with their organization and franchise right now. Do they give the reins over to Jared Stidham and say, we fully trust you, lead the Patriots from here on out? Apparently, they've been looking heavily into Jordan Love. Again, this team has no second-round pick in this year's draft. So I do think they're a candidate to trade back and try to acquire some more draft capital. Their defense is relatively old, and they have to have some sort of I'm in win now mode. When you look at the wide receiver need, they still do have a little bit of depth at that position. They do have Julian Edelman, they have Mohamed Sanu when healthy, and N'Keal Harry. Again, he was a first-round pick for them last year, got that high ankle sprain at the beginning of the season, and was never really able to catch traction and get on the field to make an impact for the Patriots. So they do technically have some options at the wide receiver position, which is why I have them selecting in the first round Patrick Queen. Again, as I just mentioned though, I think this is a team that definitely is a candidate for trading back into the second round to acquire maybe an additional second round pick, because they do have a few different third round picks and a lot of different needs, especially with all the players they lost this offseason. Patrick has great anticipation and explosion off the line of scrimmage. And if you look at the games where he performed the best, they were all against a big-time opponent. I mean, they're all against the Clemsons and against the Alabamas. That's when he played his best, was against the best competition. He only was a one-year starter, so to look at that from both angles, that could mean he can improve a lot more because he doesn't have a lot of game time experience. This is a guy that's got a high ceiling, but also that means maybe we don't know all of his flaws yet, because we haven't gotten a chance to see him over a multiple year time period. But I think Patrick Queen would be the selection here for the New England Patriots if they weren't able to trade back. The New Orleans Saints have the 24th overall selection, and they've had a pretty good offseason so far. They added Emmanuel Sanders and Malcolm Jenkins, and they only lost a backup quarterback in Teddy Bridgewater. So obviously they added some pieces that can help contribute to the team and only lost a backup quarterback. So when you're looking at their team needs, they really don't have a lot of glaring team needs. So I think this is going to be a situation where it's best player available. And I think Kenneth Murray fits terrifically for the New Orleans Saints here at this pick. He's an athletic freak. At 6'2", 241 pounds, he ran a 4.52 40-yard dash. He's a tackling machine. It's like he's a heat-seeking missile with great pursuit, finding whoever has the ball and punishing them. He does a great job of disguising his blitzes, and he's extremely versatile. I mean, he not only can blitz, but he can also drop back in man and zone coverage and do a proficient job. So he's a very, very versatile linebacker. And Kenneth moves extremely well with great explosion. I think he's a piece that could help put them that extra step higher to win the Super Bowl. The Minnesota Vikings have the 25th overall selection in this year's draft. And it's very obvious they need a wideout. They're looking at a wideout. That's why those trade rumors happen to pop up with Odell Beckham Jr. There has to be some sort of validity behind it, because anytime someone's name is brought up in a trade rumor and there's a corresponding price that's attached to them, usually the player's being shopped. I don't know if the Vikings are going to get Odell Beckham Jr. at this year's draft, but assuming they're not, I think they draft Brandon Ayuk with their 25th overall selection. Ayuk runs extremely crisp routes, and he has an unbelievably quick burst of speed while in his route tree. That, with just a natural top-end speed he has, allows him to create so many yards after the catch. I mean, this is the king of yak. A knock on him is that he's not all that physical of a wide receiver. But in the same token, you don't have to be extremely physical at wide receiver to be successful. I think Ayuk really has a chance to be something special. He only played 2 seasons for Arizona State because he was a JUCO transfer, but just recently last season, he really made special things happen when he had the ball in his hands. The Miami Dolphins have the 26th overall selection, which is their 3rd first-round pick in this year's draft. And again, just to recap, after picking up Tua and Austin Jackson, their 2 biggest needs after that are running back and safety, which is why I have the Miami Dolphins selecting DeAndre Swift. I know DeAndre Swift isn't the biggest back at 5'8", but he does a lot of things extremely well, and he's very versatile. He's got great top-end speed after running a 4.48 40-yard dash, and he's got extremely good quickness. He's very shifty out there, and he's got good vision. He also has a great understanding of the play being called. He understands where holes are going to open up before they actually open up because he understands the concept and the scheme as a whole. DeAndre also is a great pass catcher. And, even though he's not the tallest running back in the world, again, he's only 5'8", he's also really well built. He's 212 pounds and does everything extremely well. He definitely has the ability to be an every down back. The Seattle Seahawks have the 27th overall selection in this year's draft, and they definitely had a lot of moving and shaking this offseason as well. They brought in 4 new offensive linemen to replace George Fant and Infetti leaving. They also added Bruce Irvin, but it looks like they're going to lose Jadeveon Clowney in free agency. Again, his asking price is extremely high, and I'm not sure the Seahawks want to meet that price. Even with Jadeveon Clowney last season, the Seahawks were only 31st in the NFL in pressures. And when it gets down to the brass tacks, that's just not good enough. The biggest needs for them in this year's NFL draft is offensive and defensive line, which is why I have them selecting Yetur Gross-Matos with the 27th overall selection. Yetur does a great job of setting the outside edge on rushes and has pretty good speed off the snap of the ball. And he's able to use that pretty good initial burst of speed off the line of scrimmage to work into a power rush move and create pressure. He struggles when a stronger offensive lineman gets inside hands. He really can't disengage and go ahead and create pressure. And at some times when you watch his film, there are some plays that leave you desiring a little bit more effort. Again, I don't want to question a young man's motor, but sometimes when he explodes off the ball and he's able to go ahead and get his inside hands, he looks dominant. And then other plays, you could just tell the effort wasn't there that we saw a few plays ago. I think Yetur is also very fluid in his pass rush and just how he moves on the field. He doesn't look robotic, where some defensive ends tend to be extremely muscle-bound and they can't really move all that well. That's not the case with Yetur. He is extremely smooth and fluid with his motions. The Baltimore Ravens have the 28th overall pick in this year's draft, and they've really improved their defensive line this offseason. They added Calais Campbell, Michael Brockers, and Derek Wolfe. But Marshall Yanda on the offensive line did retire this offseason, so that definitely hurts. The biggest needs they have to address in this year's draft are definitely the linebacker core, offensive line to find Marshall Yanda's replacement, and maybe a wide receiver as another depth piece. With a 28th overall selection, I have the Baltimore Ravens selecting Zach Bond. Zach's an outside linebacker with good lateral quickness, and he's got a good economy of movement. You never see him wasting steps out there on the field. He's great in the pursuit of the ball carrier, and he has the chop move down to a science. Anytime he's pass rushing, you'll always see that chop, and he rips right past the offensive lineman, and that's how he's able to go ahead and create extreme pressure. The Tennessee Titans have the 29th overall selection in this year's draft, and they have lost a lot of pieces this offseason. They released Delanie Walker, Ryan Suckup, Dion Lewis, and Cameron Wake, and that's not even including other pieces that they've traded away or lost in free agency. They also traded away Jarrell Casey. They also lost Marcus Mariota and Jack Conklin this offseason. And all they really brought back in was Vic Beasley. The Titans expect Dennis Kelly to fill the role of Jack Conklin, which makes the team's biggest needs pass rushers and cornerbacks. The Titans are still in the running for Jadeveon Clowney and have kicked the tires on Everson Griffin, so they're definitely going to go ahead and address the pass rushing need this offseason. I have them selecting Trayvon Diggs with a 29th overall pick in this year's draft. Trayvon's a tall corner with good instincts and jumps routes well. When he plants his foot and drives on a ball, it's textbook. He moves extremely well for his size, and he does a great job in zone coverage. The Green Bay Packers have the 30th overall pick in this year's draft, and they've lost a few pieces this offseason. They released Jimmy Graham, they lost Brian Bulaga, and they lost Blake Martinez in free agency. Despite losing their starting right tackle in Bulaga and their middle linebacker in Blake Martinez, the biggest need this team has this offseason is a legitimate wide receiver threat. Devontae Adams has been carrying the load for the Packers for quite some time now, and if they are able to add a legitimate number 2 wide receiver threat to that team, it would prevent him from being double teamed almost every single play. So their biggest need in this year's draft is addressing wide receiver. I have the Packers selecting T. Higgins with the 30th overall pick. At 6'4", he just naturally creates a size mismatch for smaller corners, and he's a legitimate red zone threat. T has good hands, and he also can separate once the ball is in the air. You also see him make adjustments through contact, meaning that when he goes up for that ball, he's going to be a legitimate threat to come down with it every single time. The San Francisco 49ers have the 31st overall pick in this year's draft, And I know I talked about it earlier. Maybe the 49ers would target a defensive tackle to replace DeForest Buckner with their last first-round pick in this year's draft. I'm going to go a little off the board with this pick. I know Weston Richburg tore his patella tendon last year, and he expects himself to be 100% ready to go come the first game of the regular season. It's really tough to come back from those patella tendon injuries. And I could maybe see the 49ers selecting Cesar Ruiz. If they draft Ruiz, it tells you all you need to know about how Weston Richburg is recovering from that torn patella tendon. Cesar is extremely powerful with a non-stop motor. He's got a good punch with accurate hand placement. And he's extremely talented at spotting and picking up different blitz packages. And he's more of a position blocker than he is a drive blocker, which means that he's probably going to remain at center for the rest of his career. The Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs has a 32nd overall pick in this year's draft. And this offseason, the biggest move they've made is adding Mike Rimmers to go ahead and help provide a little bit more protection for Patrick Mahomes. Their biggest needs going into this year's draft are cornerback, pass rusher, and running back. The Kansas City Chiefs have an extremely potent offense, so I think they're definitely going with a defensive pick in the first round, and I have them penciled in to pick A.J. Terrell. A.J. has good discipline and is more of a reactionary corner than an anticipatory corner. Don't get me wrong, obviously he still anticipates certain plays based off what the quarterback's doing, where he's looking on the field, based off of what type of route tree the wide receiver is running, but in the same token, he's not a corner that's going to try to jump every single route because he's anticipating. He's more of a guy who reacts to what happens and goes ahead and exploits the situation with his God-given gifts. The biggest knock on him is that he didn't necessarily play all that well against LSU, but in the same token, not many cornerbacks did this season. And that wraps up my mock draft, guys. My God, did it take a long time to create. But I think I provided pretty good context as to why teams had certain positional needs and why certain players could go ahead and address those needs, all based off of their offseason moves and the play they exhibited last season. But if you guys enjoyed this video, please let me know by subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, commenting below. Just let me know what you think of the mock draft, guys. Hopefully, your team doesn't disappoint you on draft day.